Good evening and welcome to the Martha B. Alworth Memorial Lecture, the first lecture in the 2018-19 season of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice. I'm Royal Alworth, Martha's oldest, and we have to admit, smartest son. I'm here to say a little bit about Martha. Following her death in 2012, one lecture in the series is chosen that best reflects her interest in the subject examined by the series. Mom was connected to the St. Scholastica campus as a student, a trustee, and as a generous supporter. During her life, she worked to find ways to support the causes of justice and give thoughtful consideration to peaceful and sustainable solutions to conflicts. Her desire to explore and learn developed over a lifetime and took her all over the United States and to every continent of the world except Antarctica. She believed that it's imperative that learning about peaceful conflict resolution begin as early as possible. And her support of this idea led to the establishment of this program. Everywhere she went, she wanted to meet people, hear about their lives, their histories, their joys, and their challenges. Her travels helped her take a broad view of nearly any issue. Thus, the subject of this year's series, Unraveling the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, she would approach from a perspective of her numerous travels to Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Jordan. Thank you for being here this evening. Now I'd like to introduce the director of the program and my friend, Tom Morgan.
Thank you for that, Royal. And I have to say, I was one of the fortunate people who did know Martha, going back even before my association with the College of St. Scholastica. And she was always a great supporter, both morally and financially, with all kinds of peacemaking causes that I was a part of, and so were others. So she is missed. Anyway, on behalf of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice, I welcome you all to this first in a series of lectures on a very difficult problem, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These lectures, as you know, are sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at the college, and we're very grateful to the Alworth family for their generous and continued generous support. They also are funded in part by the Warner series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Ivre Foundation, and the Mary C. Van Ivre Foundation Endowed Fund in memory of William Van Ivre, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, the Royal D. Alworth Jr. Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth, the UMD Department of World Languages and Cultures, Reader Weekly of Duluth, and from numerous other private donors. I'm so grateful for their support. I say this every time, but I really mean it. It wouldn't happen without you. The college doesn't have that big a budget, so it really helps. If you're interested in following what we do here and want to be on our mailing list, email or snail mail, I mean, we do both. We have sign-up sheets in the lobby, and please fill one of those out, and we'll put you on the mailing list. Please write very legibly and print, actually, and because sometimes we have trouble figuring out what your email address is, so that's a problem. But we're happy to include you. In fact, we want to include you. There are at least two other organizations out in the lobby that are supportive of this whole project, and they have tables out there and information about what they're all about. So at the very least, I want to bring them to your attention. One is Veterans for Peace, and there's a table out there for that organization. And the other one is the Twin Ports Peace, Not Walls group, which is a small group, but a very vocal group here in the Twin Ports that is particularly interested in this Palestine-Israeli problem. They have a table, and you can hear more about them, or hear more about what they're doing if you go there. After the lecture, that is next week, we invite you to come together again and talk about what we've heard, critique it, find what we liked, what we didn't like about it. And this particular session will be moderated or conducted by my colleague Neil Kai. I hope you all got one of these flyers. It tells you the place and time. And there's Neil's biography and his credentials. I think he is eminently qualified to lead a conversation about this issue. In fact, I have to tell you, he's the one I consulted with. He's one of the people I consulted with in putting this lecture series together, and he said, you got to get James Gelvin. So, and we did. After the lecture, after Professor Gelvin's lecture, we'll have Q&A, question and answers. When that time comes, we invite you to come to these two microphones and ask your question in an orderly fashion, and our speaker will recognize you in turn. We like to give special attention to the students. Students go first. They get to ask the questions first, because without them, our enterprise wouldn't exist. So please defer to the students if they have a question. And sometimes I have found students have very good questions. Oh yes, one more thing to promote. And this material should be out there too. This is a program that's operated by another colleague of mine who wasn't able to be here, Elise Carter-Vosen. But it's a program run under the Auric Alpern Interreligious Forum, Sacred Responsibility, Interfaith Conversation about Immigration and Sanctuary. This program and the information about it is on these flyers which are out there. Will be held Thursday, October 11th, Peace United Church of Christ. So you're invited to come to that, of course. In front of you, on either side of me, we're displaying the text of tonight's lecture through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to the technology. A special thank you to the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this inclusive service possible tonight. Another benefactor and a supporter of this program. I'm very grateful for that. One last thing about technology. If you have any in your pocket or purse, please turn it off. And we give our attention to our speaker. He came a long way to do this. And by the way, I was just chatting with him earlier, and he's got a whole bunch of other gigs this year, and he was telling me Switzerland and London, and I don't remember. But this will be the high point, right? Duluth for you, right? So we're lucky to have him. Our speaker is a scholar of Middle Eastern history, and he's been a faculty member in the Department of History at the University of California, Los Angeles since 1995. He's written extensively on the history of the modern Middle East with particular focus on nationalism and the social and cultural history of the area. In addition to his position with the History Department, he's been a co-director at UCLA's Center for Near Eastern Studies. Professor Gelvin has a master's degree from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and a PhD from Harvard. Before joining the faculty at UCLA, he taught at MIT, Boston College, and at Harvard. He's been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a recipient of the UC President's Fellowship in the Humanities, and in 2002-2003, he was a visiting professor of history at the American University in Beirut. 3 years ago, the Middle East Studies Association honored Professor Gelvin with its undergraduate teaching award, citing his outstanding commitment to the practice and substance of undergraduate teaching. His book on the Israeli-Palestine conflict was named an outstanding academic title by the American Library Association, and the UCLA chapter of Mortarboard National Senior Honor Society presented him with a Faculty Excellence Award and so on and so on and so on. More grants and honors too numerous to mention. He's also the author of many, many articles and books on the Middle East, and two of his books that I thought were most appropriate for this evening. These books will be available in the lobby after the program. The New Middle East, and the Israeli-Palestine Conflict. Professor Gelvin lives in Santa Monica with his partner Lynn, who works for Los Angeles County, and their Pomeranian Jackal. Besides thinking and writing about the Middle East, Professor Gelvin is a tourist, and he loves to travel and visit other areas. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor James L. Gelvin.
I want to thank Professor Morgan. I want to thank the Alworth family. I want to thank everybody here at St. Scholastica. And no, he wasn't kidding about this being one of the high points of my travels this year. Lake Superior has always been on my bucket list, and now I can just cross that one off. What I want to do today is I want to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Many of you probably were glued to your television sets or listening to the radio today at the Kavanaugh hearings. So I think that after listening to Democrats and Republicans today, we'll talk about something common, which is this 130-year struggle between Israelis and Palestinians. I was asked to give a historical background for the conflict. And I want to say that this title is actually true, 130 years within less than an hour. So forgive me if I forget about your favorite war or your favorite situation, whatever it might be, in the Middle East. There's only so much you can do within this period of time. What I want to do is lay out the broad contours and set up the other two speakers and the comedy troupe that's going to be here over the course of this year. First, though, before I start laying out the history, what I want to do is to make several points, 6 points to be precise, about the nature of the conflict itself. The conflict, in my opinion, is both trivial and mundane. I think you're going to see some aspects of that as I go on. But first of all, what I want to do is to put the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians within some broader framework. First of all, Israel's population, here is Israel. Israel's population is approximately 8 million, which is less than 10% of the population of Turkey or Iran or Egypt. As a matter of fact, it's approximately the size of the population of London or New York. The size of the Palestinian population in the territories, and here are the territories. That's the West Bank. That's the Gaza Strip, or Gaza. There are approximately 4.5 million Palestinians in the territories. That's slightly more than the population of Los Angeles. Now, estimates of the total number of population, the total population of Palestinians in the world is about 11.5 million, which is slightly more than the population of Belgium. So what we're dealing with here is very, very small populations on both sides. There's this famous story about Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt in the 1950s. And he went to a conference in Bandung, Indonesia, a conference of non-aligned powers. And the story has it that he goes up, Zhou Enlai, who is at that point, the premier of China, goes up to him and he says, Gamal, you look pretty down. I mean, what's your problem? And Nasser says, it's those Israelis. They're really, you know, I can't solve this problem. They're all over the place. They're mean and awful and so on and so forth. And Zhou Enlai says, well, wait a minute, Nasser, how many Israelis are there? And Nasser says, well, there's 2 million of them. And Zhou Enlai, being the premier of China, says, well, what hotel are they staying at? Here is a map of relative sizes of countries around the world, if measured by population. See if you could find Israel-Palestine on this map. Now, Israel, within its internationally recognized borders, which is 80% of the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, Israel, within its internationally recognized borders, is around the size of New Jersey. Here is a map of Israel-Palestine overlaid in the Middle East. Here it is. You can see the size, the relative size of the territory. It is not very large. So, not very large population, not very large territorially. Well, what about the tragedy of the various wars that have taken place between Israel and its neighbors and between Israel and the Palestinians? Well, it's been estimated that between 1948 and today, there have been approximately 150,000 casualties in the wars that have taken place between Israel and its neighbors and Israel and the Palestinians. Now, of course, that's a tragedy. But look at it this way. The Bosnian War of 1992 to 1995 left approximately 250,000 dead. Much shorter period of time, much higher casualties. The Rwandan genocide that took place in 3 months in 1994, for example, left 500,000 to 850,000 people dead. Then, of course, there is the worst of them all, which was the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, 500,000 to 1 million dead, 1 to 2 million wounded. So in terms of casualties, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Israel's neighbors, pales in comparison. Now, the the second point I want to make is that the dispute has gone on for such a long time and has been the subject of so much debate that it's easy to lose sight of exactly what the dispute is all about. The dispute, simply put, is about land. Frequently when I give this lecture, by the way, I get eye-rolling and say, of course, somebody from LA is going to say it's about real estate. It is about real estate. It is about land. It's about basically the ownership of land. Specifically, Jewish immigrants who are united by their allegiance to a nationalist ideology called Zionism, and Palestinians, amongst whom the Zionists settled, both claim an exclusive right to control all, or at least part, of the territory that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, east to west, and from the Sinai Peninsula in the south to Lebanon in the north. Okay. Point number 3 that I want to make. Despite the claims of both sides, this is not a struggle that has lasted from time immemorial. Least of all, this is not a religious struggle in any way, shape, or form. This is a quintessential nationalist struggle, which of course is the model struggle that we see across the 19th and 20th century. Nationalisms began to emerge in Europe in the 18th century, and then spread throughout the rest of the world in the 19th century. So at best we can say that the roots of the struggle go back, approximately a century and a half or so. A distinct Jewish nationalism, called Zionism, began to emerge in the mid to late 19th century in Eastern Europe. It emerged in response to European anti-Semitism. A distinct Palestinian nationalism emerged much later, and it emerged as a result of Jewish immigration into Palestine. In other words, Palestinians were othered by the Zionists who moved into the area. Now, let me say a couple of things about this. Number one, Just because Palestinian nationalism emerged later than Zionism, and just because it emerged in response to Zionism, doesn't mean that it is less valid than Zionism. Zionism, of course, emerged, as I said, in response to European anti-Semitism. It would be perverse to say, therefore, that Jewish nationalism is less genuine in some way than the European anti-Semitism that spawned it. Zionism, of course, is no less valid. Palestinian nationalism is no less valid than anything else. All nationalisms are true. All nationalisms are false. Every time I say that, I should probably end up by saying, oh grasshopper. Nationalisms are true inasmuch as they create nations where nations had not existed before. There was no Jewish nation before Zionism. Judaism is a religious community. Zionism created a Jewish nation. Zionism created a Jewish nation. Palestinian nationalism created a Palestinian nation. So therefore, they're valid. But in the same sense, they're making things up, because both of them created a nation where nations had not existed before. Point number 4. As in the case of all nationalisms, every side claims that it has a historic right to a specific territory that it has inhabited. That territory was either the site of that nation's greatest triumphs or the birth of that nation. But a right derived from descent is a fabrication of nationalism. It's something that nationalists make up. There is no right to a specific territory that any people has, whether or not it's the Jewish nation or the Palestinian nation, the American nation, or the French nation. Whether or not modern Jews are descended from the ancient Hebrews, and whether or not, therefore, they have a right to establish a state where the kingdom of David once was, whether or not the Palestinians are descended from the Canaanites or the Philistines, is totally irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the reality that we are confronting now. Point number 5. One of the reasons why the conflict has been so difficult to resolve is that it has never stood alone purely. It's never been Israeli or Zionist versus Palestinians. The conflict has been submerged in other conflicts as well. For example, from 1948 to 1993, most of the world refused to look at the conflict as an Israel-Palestinian conflict. Instead, they viewed it as a conflict between Israelis and generic Arabs, between the state of Israel and Arab nations. This is not what the conflict was all about, and beginning in 1993, the conflict once again became between the two principles that are involved in it. Therefore, I choose in my writings to talk about an Israel-Palestine conflict, not an Arab-Israeli conflict. And in my writings, I talk about an Arab-Israeli conflict as a phase of a conflict that took place between 1948 and 1993. And finally, while the struggle between Zionists and their descendants on the one hand, and Palestinians on the other hand, is at the core and has never changed from being at the core of the conflict between the conflict in that part of the Middle East, we can say that the conflict itself has gone through significant changes over time. And today what I want to do for the remainder of this lecture is to talk about 4 turning points in that conflict. Those turning points are 1917, 1948, 1967, and 1993. Let's start off with 1917. The territory, which is now Palestine, was part of the Ottoman Empire from 1517 to 1918. The Ottomans made some mistakes in their 400 years of rule in the Middle East, in the Balkans, in North Africa. One of the mistakes was by joining the losing side in World War I, which is what they did. At the end of the war, the British, who fought on the winning side of World War I, got control over Palestine. Now, during the war, the British had made a commitment to the Zionist movement, Jewish nationalists, to support their aspirations in Palestine, their aspirations to establish a national home in Palestine. This was made in the famous Balfour Declaration, pretty much two sentences that caused a hell of a lot of trouble ever since. It was published in the Times of London by Lord Balfour, who was foreign minister, of course. And it read in part, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now, why did the British, of all people, promise the establishment of a national home? And this has been a bone of contention ever since. Some people attribute it to British anti-Semitism, thinking that the Jews controlled the world, so therefore, in order to win this war, we will do something nice for the Jews. Or, for example, to keep the United States and Russia in World War I. Many of the Bolshevik leaders were of Jewish origin. Two of Woodrow Wilson's top advisors, Felix Frankfurter and Louis Brandeis, were ardent Zionists. So why not do something nice for them and to keep them both in the war? Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain during this time, himself in his memoirs say that there was gives 9 reasons for the promulgation of this promise to the Zionist movement. Some of them are more believable than others. For example, he said that the British Empire had always been on the side of people who yearned to be free. Yeah, except Ireland and India, maybe. The most reasonable story for the promulgation of the Balfour Declaration goes like this. A guy drops dead on the streets of New York. A crowd forms. Cops there says, okay, break it up, nothing happening, so on and so forth. Little old lady pushes her way into the crowd. You know, says, give him some chicken soup. Give him some chicken soup. Cop says, lady, the guy is dead. It's not going to help him. Well, it can't hurt him either. In other words, the Balfour Declaration was probably promulgated because it might not have helped, but it certainly could not hurt the British cause in World War I. What matters, though, is that the British threw their support behind a national movement. Think of all the national movements that have failed in history. Think of Confederate nationalism, for example. The very fact that a great power would give its support to a national movement, to a Jewish nationalism, gave the Jewish nationalism, that Jewish nationalism, a leg up. It made it possible for that Jewish nationalism to weather storms. Okay. During the interwar period, the British enabled the immigration of Jews into Palestine. By the end of the interwar period, Jews made up approximately 1/3 of the population of Palestine. Now, the Jewish organizations bought up a huge amount of land from both large landowners, Palestinian landowners, absentee for the most part, and from Palestinian peasants themselves. Therefore, they were bound to get into conflict, and which is exactly what began to happen starting in the late 1920s and into the 1930s, a conflict between the Zionist population, the settler population, and the indigenous Palestinian population. The stage was set for disaster. And that disaster occurred in 1948 when the British, being broke after World War II and trying to get out of many of its commitments, found out that it could not station the necessary 100,000 troops in Palestine that would have been necessary to keep the peace, and dumped the Palestine question on the United Nations. The United Nations then voted on Palestine and decided to divide the territory between the Zionists and the Palestinians, creating the basis for the first Palestine War. This brings us to 1948, that first Palestine War. The first Palestine War was actually two wars in one. The first Palestine War began with a war between the Palestinians and the Zionists, and the Zionist community prevailed over the Palestinian community. This led to two things. Number one, the declaration of statehood for Israel, the State of Israel in 1948. And number two, 720,000 Palestinians were forced to flee. A large number of Palestinians were forced to flee. Some did so because they were expelled. Others did so because of acts of terrorism that made them fear for their lives. And others did so because it's a reasonable thing for Palestinians or anybody else to leave a war zone, which is exactly what happened. Most fled to the west bank of the Jordan River, others to the Gaza Strip in the south. The west bank of the Jordan River after 1948 was occupied by the Jordanians. The Gaza Strip was occupied by the Egyptians. Others fled to Arab states surrounding Palestine, Israel-Palestine. And others, of course, made it further abroad. Those with, for example, skills, with education, with money, for example, made it to Europe and North America. There's probably some people in this audience whose ancestors come from the 48ers. Those who fled to surrounding areas fled to refugee camps, where many of them and their descendants live to this very day. This is important for an important contemporary reason, which is that about 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump announced that the United States was going to stop funding the United Nations efforts, refugee centers throughout the Middle East, stop funding the organization called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Administration, that's responsible for taking care of Palestinians, citing that the Palestinians should not become a culture of dependency. This, of course, was Jared Kushner who said that. It's a bit ironic that Jared Kushner would talk about cultures of dependency. Anyway, to this very day, Palestinians demand the right to return, that is, the right to go back to their ancestral homes in Palestine. It was after the beginning of the flight of Palestinians that the Arab states surrounding Palestine declared war on the newly declared state of Israel and invaded. The boundaries that are internationally recognized of Israel today are the Armistice Lines from the 1948 war. The international community saw the problem in the region as being a problem between Israel and its sovereign neighbors, those who invaded. This was a problem between Israel and Syria, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt. It was not a problem, as far as the international community saw, as between Israel, or the Zionist movement, and the Palestinian population. Looking at the totality of the struggle as one between Israel and its neighbors as the sole problem in the region, therefore, is mistaken, because it ignores probably the most important actor on the other side, which is the Palestinians. So, to recap, why is 1948 important? Number one, it saw the establishment of the State of Israel. Number two, it was the beginning of the Palestinian refugee problem, a refugee problem that remains unresolved to the present day. And number three, it made it appear that a conflict between two peoples, between Zionists and Palestinians, was actually a conflict between states, Israel and its Arab neighbors. 1967. Nobody was happy with the results of the 1948 war. The Arab states wanted to reverse the consequences of the war, and Israel was unhappy with the borders that came out of the war. Tensions built over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s. And in 1967, war broke out between Israel and its neighbors. Israel struck first, but most historians credit or give the blame to the Arab states and their Russian backers, their Soviet backers, for egging them on. The war was over in a mere 6 days, yet it had changed the map of the region. At the end of the war, Israel occupied the West Bank, which had been under Jordanian control, Gaza, which had been under Egyptian control, Sinai, which was Egyptian territory, the Golan Heights, which had belonged to Syria, and Jerusalem, which had been divided between Israel and Jordan after the 1948 war. The Arab states, which had waged war to reverse the consequences of the 1948 war, shifted their goals. Now their goals was to reverse the consequences of the second war, of the 1967 war, and to regain the territory that they had lost before. They wanted their land back. The Israelis, on the other hand, wanted diplomatic recognition from the surrounding Arab states. And so what developed out of the 1967 war was a perfect bargaining position. The Arabs would give Israel recognition, and Israel would give the Arabs their land back. This was embodied in UN Resolution 242, which is also called the Land for Peace formula. The Land for Peace formula has been the basis for every peace treaty signed between Israel and its neighbors ever since. For example, in 1979, the Israelis signed a peace treaty with the Egyptians. In exchange for diplomatic relations with the Egyptians, the Israelis gave the Sinai back to the Egyptians. In 1994, the Israelis signed a peace treaty with Jordan. In exchange for peace with Jordan, they gave Jordanian territory that they had occupied back as well. Now, not all the land that the Israelis had conquered in 1967 was so easy to dispense with. There was ideological reasons that the Israelis didn't want to give up some territory. There was defense reasons Israelis didn't want to give up some territories as well. After the 1967 war, the Israelis annexed Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not up for negotiation. Jerusalem would be the undivided capital of Israel, the perpetual capital of Israel. Ever since then, Israel has recognized Jerusalem as its single undivided capital, in the same way that Palestinians have also recognized Israel as their capital as well. The United States, of course, until very recently, claimed that this was a situation that had to be figured out between the two parties. The thumb was put on the scale earlier this year when the United States moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, thereby implicitly recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So Jerusalem was one territory that the Israelis did not want to give back. Another territory that the Israelis had difficulty parting with was the Palestinian territories, the territory of the West Bank and then the Gaza Strip. Okay. Territory of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Gaza and Israel, well, Israel claimed that Gaza and the West Bank could not be returned to anybody simply because Jordan, that controlled the West Bank, and Gaza, and Egypt, that controlled Gaza, were not the real owners of these territories. So there was no place that they could return them to. So therefore, what the Israelis began to do was not only maintain control over Gaza and the West Bank, but actually began to colonize Gaza and the West Bank as well. They built settlements in these territories. As you can see, these settlements are not trailers or even double wides or tents that are pitched in the desert. They are communities that could look like any bedroom community in Minnesota or any other state in the United States. Over time, the settlements expanded, making it more and more difficult for the Israelis to abandon them, on the one hand, and making it more and more difficult for the Palestinians to create a state in the West Bank if they were granted the privilege of doing so. As of now, there are about 400,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank. There's about 200,000 Israeli settlers in Jerusalem. The Israeli government does not call them settlers since they've annexed Jerusalem. That brings us to about 600,000 settlers in all, which is about 13% of the Israeli population. The settlements, by the way, according to most jurists in international law, are illegal. The United States has gradually backed away from that. At first, for the United States, they were illegal. Then they were an impediment to peace. And now they are simply a bargaining chip. So these were the effects of the 1967 war. But there was one further effect of the 1967 war. During the war, the Arabs blew it. They wanted to liberate Palestine, but were unable to do so. And not only were unable to do so, but within 6 days, the Arab armies were smashed. Therefore, the Palestinians reasonably understood after the Six-Day War that if they wanted the liberation of their territory, they would have to take it on themselves to liberate their territory. During the 1970s and the 1980s, the Palestine Liberation Organization was recognized by first the Palestinians, then the Arab states, then the world community as a sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian community. During the 1970s and the 1980s, the Palestinian Liberation Organization committed acts of terrorism to keep the Palestine question on the international agenda. They were very effective. We are talking today about the Israel-Palestine conflict. We are not talking about the Moroccan-Sahrawi conflict at all. As a matter of fact, I would doubt that very many people in this audience knows that there is a conflict between Moroccans and a people who call themselves the Sahrawis. The reason for that is that the PLO was very effective in keeping the Palestine question alive during this period. The ethics of what they did, that's questionable, but the fact that they accomplished what they accomplished was something that you might have to say is admirable. This brings us to 1993. In 1993, an unofficial delegation of Palestinians met with an unofficial delegation of Israelis in Oslo, Norway. I was told that all I have to do is mention Norway and I'd get cheers from the audience. These two unofficial delegations hammered out an agreement, which they then took to their respective governments. The agreement has been called ever after the Oslo Accord. Now, the Oslo Accord consists of two sets of agreements. The first set of agreement was between was mutual recognitions between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Palestinians, whose spokesman was the PLO, recognized the state of Israel. The Israelis recognized a Palestinian nation, not a state, a Palestinian nation, whose representative in negotiations would be the Palestine Liberation Organization. This was probably the most important part of the Oslo Accord because this is the accord that people go back to when they talk about a two-state solution. The Palestinians recognize the state of Israel, so the best the Palestinians could have would be a state on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This was also problematic for the Palestinians since the Israeli state could only get larger and the Palestinian state could only get smaller in negotiations, particularly as settlements expanded over the course of the years. So the first accord was about mutual recognitions. The second accord was a step-by-step process whereby the Israelis would begin a withdrawal from the Palestinian territories and continue negotiations with the Palestinians, resulting in, that was never clearly laid out. Most Palestinians, of course, felt that it would lead to the creation of a Palestinian state. At the time, the Israeli government thought that this would lead to a confederation between the West Bank and the state of Jordan. Currently, the Israelis are talking about something called state minus. In other words, the Palestinians would have a state in name, but the Israelis would control borders and airspace and security and the water table and a whole variety of other things, the state minus. Anyway, the whole idea was that the Israelis would begin their withdrawal from Palestinian territories and that a Palestinian authority would take its place. Elections were held, a Palestinian authority that was made up of the largest constituent of the Palestine Liberation Organization, took control of the urban areas of the West Bank. The problem was that after the first withdrawal and the second withdrawal, the withdrawals got smaller and smaller and then non-existent. But before we get into that, why did the Israelis do this? Well, there are multiple reasons why the Israelis went to the bargaining table. The first was that the Palestinians in the territories got to be difficult to control. In 1987, an uprising broke out in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, in which Palestinians took on directly the occupation. The Israelis, who had longed for normalcy in the territories, now had to confront an armed uprising that was not only economically debilitating, but also morally debilitating as well. You look at the picture, it shows a child with rocks in his hand throwing those rocks at an Israeli tank. That was the quintessential picture of what was called the First Intifada, the first uprising against Israel, the Israeli occupation, and Israel certainly lost the war of international opinion. The other thing was that Israel, this was the end of the Cold War, and Israel now longed for the sort of normal existence of any other state, which would be impossible as long as Israel remained in occupation of the West Bank, preventing the Palestinians from their right of self-determination. Between independence and 2016, for example, there have been 219 Security Council resolutions condemning Israel, the vast majority of them condemning Israeli settlement policy or policies in the territories. So as I said, the Israelis began to pull back, and over time, that pullback stalled. Now, there's a number of reasons why that pullback began to stall. First of all, there were just minor issues on the table that had to be resolved, like Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, borders, security, water, small issues like that, that of course are not easily reconcilable. Now, they might have been reconciled through compromise. And as a matter of fact, there has been a compromise that's been on the table since 2000. It's a compromise that was known as the Clinton parameters. And it's a very simple compromise. For example, take Jerusalem. Israel says Jerusalem should not be divided. Fine. Nobody's going to divide Jerusalem. It's going to be shared. It's going to be shared between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians will have their own state, but it'll be demilitarized, for example. and so on and so forth. These are the ways in which these sort of things can be worked out. But the problem is that the political will is not there. The compromise has not been reached since 1993 that would be necessary to end the conflict. Why is this so? Well, first of all, the Israelis blame Palestinian violence. This is a picture from the Second Intifada, much more violent rebellion by Palestinians in the territories. It was bloody. 1,000 Israelis died, civilians, in various forms of terrorist activities, including bus bombings like you see here. 4,000 Palestinians, by the way, also died during the Second Intifada. But Palestinian violence is just one explanation, and not the only explanation for why compromise hasn't been reached. I looked up the other day the history of the Northern Ireland dispute, mainly because I say that the Israel-Palestine dispute is the longest running national dispute in history. Thank you, Northern Ireland, for settling. And Northern Ireland is no longer that sort of issue. But if you look at it, the Good Friday Accords were signed, and then immediately thereafter, the worst terrorist activities took place of something called the Real Irish Republican Army did a major bombing in the town of Omagh. Now, it would have been easy for both sides at that point to have walked away, but both sides were too heavily committed to the peace process itself in order to do that. So they basically said, no, we're not going to let a few bunch of thugs actually do this to us. What we're going to do is continue the process. In the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, there are two other reasons why the Israelis are not particularly interested at the present time in reaching compromise with the Palestinians. Number one, over the last 10 years or 15 years or so, Israel has become increasingly nationalist and right-wing. Now, first of all, it's not the only country in the world, as we well know, that's becoming increasingly nationalist and right-wing. But on the other hand, this has prevented the Israeli population from supporting the sort of compromises that would be necessary to bring about peace. And in part, the violence of the Second Intifada is to blame for this. Israelis were very badly shaken by the sort of violence that would take place in their cities. But there was something else as well, which is the settlements. The settlements make a single contiguous Palestinian state in the West Bank impossible, and the settlements are supported by the Israeli government. It would be just as difficult for the Israeli government today to turn its back on the settler movement in Israel as it would be for, let's say, the American administration today to turn its back on the NRA. These things just don't happen. The settler movement provides a very, very important pillar for the current government. Over time, the Americans have tried to stop the settlement of the West Bank. Over time, George W. Bush came out with a proposal for a settlement freeze. Barack Obama came out with a proposal for a settlement freeze. And then along comes Donald Trump. Donald Trump abandoned America. That was a Freudian slip, by the way. They happen. Donald Trump abandoned America's position as a so-called honest broker. The United States never really was an honest broker, but presented itself as such. Look at what's happened in the last year or so. The current administration has moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, thereby backing Israeli claims to Jerusalem. It's expelled Palestinian diplomats from the United States. It cut off all American aid to Palestinian refugees. And it even cut off aid to joint Israeli-Palestinian groups advocating coexistence. Rather than attempting to bring the two sides together, what the current administration is apparently attempting to do is to humiliate and to weaken the Palestinian cause so that they would have to accept some form of peace settlement. It's not going to work. It's probably a fruitless pursuit. But on its 25th anniversary, which it is this year, it appears that the Oslo process itself is hopelessly deadlocked, maybe never to restart again. Thank you.
Because it's certainly not the end. So please come forward and ask Professor Gelvin some questions, and this will continue the conversation, especially students.
Well, yes. I thank you for coming, and I thank you for actually affirming the Bible in your first comments, because Israel, and specifically Jerusalem, is mentioned in the Bible as a troublesome stone before the Lord returns. And so that's a prophecy we see happening today when, back in the 1880s, I believe, when Mark Twain went through the land, it was a nondescript land. So I mentioned that. And then you mentioned the title of a book from time immemorial by Joan Peters. This was published in 1984. And she went to tell a story that was very much different than what she wrote after she did research, Ottoman censuses, and so forth. So this book, did you read it, or?
Yes, as a matter
Okay.
of fact, at the Middle East Studies Association, what we used to do was to read it to each other and laugh.
It's worth reading because it's well documented. And it tells a totally different story. And then the third thing, I brought a book called The Eye of the Storm. And God gave Israel, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a title deed of the land it's described in the Bible, which includes Israel today, but beyond that. And so when we have tried to divide Jerusalem, we have had bad effects. When the Gaza was forced to and given back to the Palestinians, the Israelis, well, the Israelis gave them factories with for the flowers and all of that. Going things, they were destroyed. And at the same time that happened, we had Katrina hit and destroyed the southern part of this nation. And so there's tie-ins. And I'm just wondering, yes, yeah. I'm just wondering these things into consideration. Is it possible that your premise of this only being 130 years and not something that goes back, such as a book in time immemorial, could be true?
Okay, there are certain things that people just have to agree to disagree on. Let me just say a couple of things about some of the things that you brought up. Yeah, I mean, Jerusalem is mentioned, of course, in the Bible. Jerusalem's also mentioned in the Quran. And Al-Aqsa Mosque is the place, the site of where, theoretically, Muhammad took his night journey to heaven. I am not a Muslim. I'm hardly a Christian. I'm certainly not Jewish. So these stories mean nothing to me. Okay, what means something to me is sort of like the reality that we have now, you know, and what we can do about it. Now, it's not a conflict. It's not a religious conflict, is what I've been trying to say. It is a conflict that is very, very modern in what it's all about. It's a conflict that is between two peoples who have modeled themselves in the same way that every other people has modeled themselves in the modern world, which is in terms of ethno-nationalism or some form of nationalism. In this case, it's ethno-nationalism. Okay? These things did not exist in the ancient world. They did not exist before, in certain parts of Eastern Europe, for example, before the 19th century, and certainly in Palestine not until the late 19th century as well. I like the Mark Twain story. It's one of my favorites, actually. I talk about it in the book because, it's in what's it called? Innocents Abroad. And he takes this trip to Palestine, and he sees these ramshackle buildings, these shacks that are built there on the coastal area of Palestine. And he comes to the conclusion that Palestine is underinhabited and that the people are very, very poor, and that basically what's necessary is something from the West to come in and to pick up this poor, benighted people and help them. What he saw was something called khurab, which is Arabic for ruins. In times in which the Ottoman state was not particularly strong, Bedouin used to attack the coastal plain with impunity. And so nobody lived down there. And at the time Mark Twain was there, the Ottoman state was quite strong. So what you saw there was, rather than an abandoned area, what you saw was shacks that were built by people who were expanding agricultural production. They lived in the plateau area, inland Palestine. They would go down to the coastal area. They would build these shacks for twice a year, once to sow crops, once to reap the crops. And so there was really no need for more heavy input on this thing, so therefore that's what he saw. So actually what he saw was, instead of seeing a failure of the Ottoman state or the people living in Palestine, what he saw was an expansion of the territory that could be cultivated. And indeed, in the late 19th century, the Arab population of Palestine doubled as a result of the Ottomans getting a second wind. I was facetious. I wasn't really facetious because we actually did do this with Joan Peters' book. The book, if you read any of the scholarly reviews of the book, it's a joke. And there's only one person who's really taken that seriously, which is, Alan Dershowitz, in his Case for Israel, which it's been fairly well demonstrated that he cribs most of that book out of from time immemorial. So it's not something that people take, seriously, who are trying to figure out exactly what the history of this region is all about.
You have pointed out that this country has failed in centuries of trying to work with Israel and Palestine. If you ran the zoo, what would you do?
You mean now or over the course of...
How to solve it?
How to solve it? Sure, why not? We are locked in a vestigial conflict within the Middle East. Okay? This is something that we've inherited from the Cold War period. During the Cold War, the United States depended on certain allies, certain satellites in the region, to do the heavy lifting for us. And the United States would have their backs. The United States depended on Israel as a check on Syria. The United States depended on Iran and Saudi Arabia as a check on Iraq. The Cold War ended. The United States is still locked in. By the way, the Iran thing, of course, ended in 1979, before the end of the Cold War. The United States is still locked into this idea that we have to somehow work with these allies of ours, Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Israel on the other. Now, when Donald Trump took his first trip, actually, he went to the Middle East. And the two sites that he went to in the Middle East were Riyadh and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. He basically underscored the relationships there that Obama was sort of distancing the United States from, and for good reason. For example, Saudi Arabia has tried to convince the United States that the biggest problem in the Middle East is terrorism, and the biggest purveyor of terrorism is Iran. Yeah, and it was Iranians that made up, what, 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11, you know? It has been estimated that over the course of its existence, the Soviet Union spent $7 billion on communist propaganda. It's been estimated that since 1973, Saudi Arabia has spent over $100 billion on the doctrine of Wahhabism, which is, you could see it every time you look at pictures of what Saudi Arabia is actually all about. The biggest purveyor of terrorism in the Middle East is certainly not Iran. We have the same relationship with Israel that we had during the Cold War. That is very problematic because Israel has not been serving American interests in a way that you would expect an ally to serve American interests. It's funny, you know, I mean, Truman had the saying that when I buy a client, I want him to stay bought, you know. But for example, the United States determined that probably one of the biggest problems in the Middle East was nuclear proliferation. And so what the United States determined to do was to prevent Iran from getting a bomb. So it spearheaded the nuclear treaty with Iran. While the United States was spearheading the nuclear treaty with Iran, Israel was doing everything possible to undercut the United States, including coming to the American Congress and attempting to get the American Congress to move against an American president. Okay? Why are we allowing this to take place? Why do we still think in terms of the Cold War? At the present time, Israel gets $4 billion a year in military aid. It's great for American arms manufacturers because now they have to buy the entirety of that in the United States. But fundamentally, Israel has got the third largest per capita army in the world after North Korea and Eritrea. Do we really have to finance Israeli, military actions? Do we really have to finance, for example, the occupation? Do we really have to do what we're doing now in terms of the Palestinians, which is cutting off UNRWA, for example, or trying to humiliate Palestinians by, for example, kicking their delegates out? And by the way, the same thing goes for Saudi Arabia, which is another vestigial thing that we have going in the Middle East. The United States is implicated now in war crimes that are being committed this very day by the Saudis in Yemen. The United States is resupplying Saudi warplanes, refueling Saudi warplanes, supplying intelligence data, and also a lot of the weapons that are being dropped on civilians, including, if you remember, that busload of children several weeks ago. That's supplied by the United States to our allies, Saudi Arabia. This is some of the stuff that I would do if I was a president of the United States. I would tend to rethink those very, very alliances.
Hi, my question is specifically. Thank you. My question is specifically around the time between the Arab states and Israel war. Who funded Israel during the war that it was powerful enough to win against all the Arab states and manipulate them into, considering them to be a nation? And specifically considering the fact that it was a newly formed nation that wasn't even recognized yet, how did the funding for the war to win against the Arab states come from?
Okay, I assume you mean 1967. Okay, let me give you two wars, 67 and 73. Who is responsible for the Israeli military up until that point? The French. The French. We had other fish to fry in 1967, the United States. We were in Vietnam at the time. The United States fundamentally had sold defensive weapons to Israel, but the Israeli pilots were flying Mirages against the Arabs in the 1967 war. So it was only after the 1967 war that the United States began to look at Israel as a strategic partner, as somebody who could do our dirty work for us. And so that's when we began to supply it. Now, if you're talking about 1973, and I didn't talk about 73, Because 73, you know, it was the worst of the Arab-Israeli wars, more casualties than any other Arab-Israeli war, but it didn't mean very much in terms of what the conflict was all about. In 1967, you had this war, you had the conquest of the Sinai, you had the conquest of the Golan Heights by the Israelis. The peace process, or the attempt, the land for peace process, had broken down. And there was no way that the Arab states were going to be able to get their land back, short of war. So the Arab states went to war in 1973, not to destroy Israel, not to get rid of the Palestinian refugee crisis by having Palestinians move back to Israel, but to restart the process again, to restart the peace process. And we see a direct link between 1973 and 1979 with the Egyptians and the peace process that started there. Now, the United States was instrumental in resupplying Israel, and actually supplying Israel before the war, resupplying Israel after the war. The United States had begun to shift in terms of its perspective on the Middle East, began to view, adopted this view of all that was necessary in order to bring about an Israel-Palestine peace was to foreclose the war option. And how do you foreclose the war option? You make Israel stronger than the sum total of all the Arab states. And that was American policy beginning in the 1970s or so. Because that so-called war option was foreclosed, it left only one option there, which was for the Arabs to go to war. And the reason for that is because the American policy, the Israeli policy is, we're just going to sit and wait for the Arabs to come to us, and if they don't come to us, then, you know, fundamentally, fine, we'll keep the land. And in order to get the American attention again, what the Americans did was what the Arabs did was they attacked Israel again. It's interesting, after the Egyptians broke through Israeli lines, they didn't know what to do. You know, the road to Tel Aviv was open at that point, and you have the general staff calling back to Anwar Sadat saying, we've broken through, now what? Because the whole idea was to break through. That was the whole idea, was to have this confrontation that the United States would intervene on. By the way, the war tended to, you know, went beyond everybody's wildest expectations. You know, the Americans went on the highest nuclear alert since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the beginning of the Arab oil embargo as a result of this war, all because the United States read signals of that was coming out of the Middle East wrong in terms of what we have to do in order to encourage some sort of peace process. What he meant was anybody under 40.
So you just mentioned the kind of ideology of the Israelis and Americans on waiting it out because they had the land and they wanted to hold on to the land. And then earlier you mentioned the PLO with their terrorism trying to keep the global stage and keep the debate going on. Would you say that this is a direct reaction to kind of that waited out ideology that, I mean, me personally, I would never find terrorism and these grievous acts as a way towards conflict resolution and peaceful resolution between states. So I guess my question is, would you say this this waiting it out like kind of created like the PLO, like terrorism, like, you know what I mean?
No, it's a good question. First of all, I don't want people to leave here with the idea of Gelvin thinks that you know, the terrorism kept the Palestinian issue alive, so therefore it was a great thing. You know, I find it morally reprehensible. I find it, you know, something that, you know, states should not sponsor, that individual organizations should not participate in, you know, et cetera. And I think that, you know, if any people actually knows what the horrors of terrorism is all about, besides the Israelis, of course, it's the Americans because of 9/11. What I was trying to say was something a little bit different, which was that we have a couple of tracks going on simultaneously. We have an Arab-Israeli track on the one hand, which is peace between the Arab states and Israel. And then we have the Palestinians who are saying, hey, wait. Resolution 242, land for peace. Where does it say anything about that? Where does it mention Palestinians? It mentions refugees, but it never mentions the word Palestinian, or even says anything about the Palestinian issue of substance. It says land for peace, return of land, recognition, and so on and so forth. This cut the Palestinians out. You know, Palestinians politically were not a factor in 1967. They were beginning to be a factor in 1969 when Yasser Arafat was elected president of the PLO. Now, since that time, the PLO has undergone a number of shifts. Initially, the PLO was committed to, Ahmed Shaqiri, the first president of the PLO, said, throw the Jews into the sea. He was committed to the liberation of all of Palestine. Starting in the 1970s, the PLO began to talk about a creation of a mini-state in the West Bank as a first step to the liberation of Palestine. Then what they did was they began to look at a mini-state in Palestine as a permanent thing that would take place, a mini-state meaning the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Then they signed on to the Oslo Accord, which meant that they recognized that Israel was going to control that 80% of the territory between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. Okay? And that the best they could hope for was that the remaining West Bank and Gaza Strip. As I said before, Israel could only get larger, the Palestinians could get larger. Let me put it another way. Hamas said something, Hamas is Hamas. Actually, they hit the nail on the head. They said, okay, we reject Oslo, but we'll negotiate with the Israelis if they want to. You want Jerusalem. Okay. You want Hebron. Okay. We want Tel Aviv. Now, when you put it that way, that sort of throws in stark relief exactly what's taking place as a result of Oslo. It's not a fair sort of like, okay, let's sit down and negotiate these things, and you could have Hebron, and you could have Jerusalem, and we'll take Tel Aviv. It's sort of like, we got Tel Aviv, we have Jerusalem, we have Hebron, and the state keeps on expanding, getting bigger. It's like what they used to say about the Brezhnev doctrine, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine too. And that's the way the Oslo Accord actually has worked. So anyway, to summarize your question, the thing about the Palestine Liberation Organization historically is the way you have to look at it is that it did keep this question alive when so much of the world was either committed to ignoring it or to destroying the Palestinian national movement. And I'm not talking, when I say destroying the Palestinian national movement, just about the Israelis. I'm talking about the Syrians. I'm talking about the Egyptians as well, both of whom would have liked to have seen the Palestinian national movement disappear.
Thanks, Professor Gelvin, for your talk, and perhaps even more so, your books, which I know some of my students here continue to learn from. My question does have to do, again, with the legacy of the Oslo Accords, which the late Palestinian scholar Edward Said said at the time offered the Palestinians nothing. And since that time, would you agree that we've been seeing, long before Trump, a convergence of U.S. foreign policy, at least in that region, with Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I don't think it's been a direct line, but I think the main idea is correct. George W. Bush at one point said that we can't expect Israel to go back to the 1967 lines. Why not? As a negotiating posture, expect Israel to go back. Just, throw it out there. You go back to 67 lines. No, we won't. Okay, so what are you going to give us? I mean, something along those lines. We gave up that negotiating posture, okay? Now, under Obama, there was something else going on, which is actually very interesting. Obama's idea was that, and I would agree with Obama's policy, but I think the execution was really poor. Some of it he couldn't help, such as the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011. some of which he should have seen the pushback that he was going to get from the Saudis and the Israelis, and should have been able to work something, make sure that that wasn't going to happen. He also should have been able to explain his policy better to the American people. His policy in the Middle East was to follow, and basically the Israel policy was subsumed underneath a Middle Eastern policy. The Middle East is worthless. We're going into a post-oil world. We don't need the oil anymore. The Middle East is the second least globalized region in the world behind sub-Saharan Africa. The Middle East, if you look at it, it's facing numerous crises that can't be resolved in the way that the United States likes to resolve crises at the point of a gun. For example, healthcare, demography, water supply, environmental degradation. All these things are affecting the Middle East. There's going to be more wars in the Middle East. Things are going to get worse. So therefore, this is what the United States should do. Disentangle itself from the Middle East. Just get out. Because the United States has bigger fish to fry, and those fish are in the Far East. The world of the 21st century is going to be created in the Far East. It's going to be China, it's going to be Southeast Asia, it's going to be the Pacific Rim. That's where the United States should focus. And why the hell are we destroying so much in terms of blood and treasure in Afghanistan, of all places, in Iraq, and various other places? Let's get out of Afghanistan and Iraq. That was the policy. Let's tamp down or resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. The first step would be, a settlement freeze. Okay? Let's, for example, bring Iran into the Middle East balance of power, because there's this old Saudi saying, ironically, which is it's better to have a camel inside your tent pissing out than to have a camel outside your tent pissing in. In other words, it's better to bring the Iranian camel into the tent, so it's part of this whole thing. It's got a stake now in the international, and it means we have to compromise with Iran. But fundamentally, why not bring it in? Why not bring it into this? So this is what Obama wanted to do. Then, once we've done that, all we have to do is solve Israel-Palestine, Iran. Then we can begin to face, East Asia and the real problems that we have there. As a policy, that's absolutely sound. The Middle East is nothing but a big sinkhole to the United States. And everything, we have a reverse Midas touch in the Middle East. Everything that we touch, it does not turn to gold, let's put it that way, So get out of the Middle East and move someplace else. So this was the American policy before the election of Donald Trump. Now, what does Donald Trump do? Donald Trump sets his Middle East policy by being the un-Obama. He looks to see what Barack Obama did and does the opposite. Probably for no other reason than Barack Obama did it and he wants to do the opposite. So Barack Obama said to Israel and said to Saudi Arabia, look, we're not going to pick your coals out of the fire anymore. What we're going to do is, we're going to give you support. If you don't want that support, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to have another Desert Storm and another invasion of Iraq. We're not going to, basically make war on Iran. And this is what, of course, made American relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia so bad. So what happens? All of a sudden, we get this sort of like rapprochement. We get this idea that Saudi Arabia is going to be our strong ally. Israel is our wonderful ally in the region. We have to get rid of the Palestinian issue. We have to put pressure on Iran. Et cetera, et cetera. This is all the stuff that has been taking place recently. It's a fundamentally irrational policy. It's fundamentally a policy that goes against everything that we've attempted to do in American history. Let's put it one more way. America was incredibly successful in its Middle East policy during the Cold War. Now, I'm not going to say it was moral in its Middle East policy during the Cold War. I'm just going to say it was successful in as much as it, accomplished practically everything it wanted to accomplish. Yeah, there were problems. There was the Iranian Revolution. There was Lebanon. We sold out the Kurds twice, for example. We've sold out the Palestinians on multiple occasions. But fundamentally, we basically accomplished everything we want. Oil, Israel, the state system, locking the Soviet Union out. We won. Think of it. How many? We lost 5,000 people during the Cold War in the Middle East. 5,000. 500. Sorry, 500 people in the Middle East. Okay, almost half of that took place in one terrorist incident in Beirut in 1983. Okay, 500 people, 55,000 in 10 years in Vietnam. Okay? Obviously, our policy in the Middle East was far more successful if viewed in American terms than the policy. And one of the ways that we accomplished what we accomplished was we got people to do all the heavy lifting for us. You know, when the Egyptians were screwing around in Yemen, we got the Saudis to finance an opposition to that. When, for example, you know, the Syrians would do what Syrians tended to do, the Israelis would do something about it, you know, and on and on and on, you know. So, I mean, this is what American policy was. After the Cold War, we turned hubristic. After the Cold War was over, we said, okay, we're the biggest guys on the block. There's nobody can come close to us anymore. So what are we going to do? What we're going to do now is we're the ones who are going to do everything ourselves. The Israelis don't have to lift a finger. The Saudis don't have to lift a finger. Nobody lifts a finger. We are going to put together the international coalition to liberate Kuwait. We are going to be the ones who, you know, fundamentally take on, you know, Iran and Iraq at the same time, the dual containment strategy. We're the ones who are going to take care of the Iraq problem by invading Iraq. Okay? That was a reversal. Now, what Obama was attempting to do was to go back to what was going, what gave America success in the Cold War, which was basically, okay, we'll have your backs, but you do the heavy lifting for us. Unfortunately, this is not the way they liked it. Obama actually called the Saudis freeloaders at a certain point. This is not what they wanted, and so therefore their pushback was the one that determined what, you know, the way things went, and that's unfortunate. That was a long-winded answer to.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I happen to be Jewish, and personally and politically, I'm very concerned about this sort of effort to equate Israel, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, and all Jews in the entire world. And in that same vein, I'm enraged by all of these, my interpretation is like newly re-energized efforts to like limit free speech by defining any critique of Israel as hate speech or anti-Semitic or racist in any way. So I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more about that, and also if you have any thoughts or ideas on what we can do to resist that. Thank you.
It's a good question, actually, and it goes to the heart of, I think, you know, your question as well, which is the problem of equating Jews, particularly American Jews, with what goes on in Israel and Israeli policy, you know. And the if you read, you know, the so-called liberal paper of Israel Haaretz, for example, it's got an English language edition. And read it, you know, and they basically talk about this big problem, this big gulf that's, you know, developing between American Jews and Israeli Jews, you know. Not all Israeli Jews, of course, but those of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox persuasion. I mean, these problems consist of many things. For example, the idea of having a place where liberal Jews and Jewish women can pray at the Wailing Wall, or having Reform rabbis being able to perform marriage ceremonies, or, you know, various things like that, which the Americans, of course, say, of course, why not? American Jews say that. And the Israelis say, absolutely not. There's a bigger issue at the present time, which is also that American Jews who are either pro-BDS or have said things that offend the Israeli government are not allowed into Israel. BDS is boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. Okay, nonviolent protest. I mean, it's not like we're, you know, BDS is saying anything. You know, that's sort of like violent or anything. It's not violent protest, and calling for boycott. Israel says that this is delegitimizing Israel, and so therefore this is anti-Semitic because it's delegitimizing the Jewish state. Yeah. Okay. I mean, there are quite a few people who are either, you know, don't like Israeli policy and or support BDS, or who, you know, are, you know, major proponents of BDS. I, for example, have just become a BDS supporter. I think it's a stupid tactic. It's never going to happen. There's not going to be a boycott. There's not going to be a sanction. And I tried to get my university to divest, but they chose not to. Okay? But the thing about it is that you don't go into a Texas town that's just been ravaged by floods and, you know, have people sign a pledge that they are not going to support BDS in order to get flood relief. Okay? You don't do that. You don't disallow people like me from going into Israel, because of our support because of our political positions. I have friends who've been turned away. I haven't tried recently, but since I publicly come out for BDS, I'm sure I will. You don't do that sort of stuff. And this is the sort of stuff that's going on now in the name of sort of like preventing anti-Semitism. There's plenty of anti-Semitism out there, believe me, particularly now. But this stuff that's going on with Israel, and those people who are saying that this occupation, which has lasted since 1967, this occupation has got to end, and the suppression of the Palestinian people just have to end, Those two things are not equitable. To be very, very political about it, okay? We have an administration right now in power that supports Israel and is supported by Israel, in spite of the fact that this is the first administration that I can remember that relies for its votes, its prestige, its lobbying on absolute anti-Semites, on declared anti-Semites, okay? And I think that, that alone should alert people to the real difference that exists between, for example, Jews and anti-Semites on the one hand, and the whole question of Israel on the other hand. Thank you.
Professor Gelvin and I are going to walk out of here now and go over to the a table where he has some of his books for sale, and he'll sign them if you buy them. And you're welcome to stay for a while and chat more about this, and we have a little reception in the lobby. Thank you all very much for coming. Another program in October, and thank you.